In this lecture, we're going to do a really quick introduction to actually how we do archaeology. This is not going to be detailed in any way, shape, or form. Again, it's just to give you an idea of how we collect our data. So this is the fieldwork portion of archaeology. It's a small portion of what we do. The majority of what we do is in the laboratory. However, we do have to collect our data, and that we do out and about in the countryside or in the city, depends on what we're doing. But anyways, so we're investigating the archaeological record, which, as we mentioned in the last lecture, is the material remains left behind by peoples. So we always start with sites. That's where we do our digging. We don't randomly just stick a shovel in the ground and start digging. We look for things. So one of the ways to find a site is to determine an area that you want to look at and then do a systematic survey. This is usually a pedestrian survey, which we're going to talk about in just a couple of minutes here. We can also use informants, which actually kind of speeds up the process because they help direct you to where they've found things, and that's a good place to start off with. Now, again, once we're doing survey, there are several ways to do it, and we always want to survey because we don't want to just randomly start digging, because the archaeology is a destructive process. You know, once we put a shovel in the ground, we're destroying the archaeological record. We cannot put it back. So we usually only want to dig for a sample if we're going to dig at all. And if we take a whole site, it's usually because it's in danger of being destroyed anyways. So survey. There are non-invasive and invasive methods to do survey. Non-invasive, the first one and one that's done most often, is a simple pedestrian survey. So this just means you go out and you walk. So normally you could do this depending on how fine-grained you want to do it. You can have people in a line, as you can see here in this top picture, walking 5 meters apart. They could be 10 meters apart. It really depends on how fine-grained you want your survey to be. Now, a lot of people, when they're doing pedestrian surveys, will use pin flags to note where they're finding things, and then you can decide if you're finding like clusters of pin flags. That might be a good place then to start doing some kind of shovel testing or invasive survey, which we'll talk about here in a sec. There's also remote sensing. There's a wide variety of remote sensing techniques available to archaeologists today. In this picture we see ground penetrating radar, but there's electromagnetics, there's magnetics, there's aerial photography, satellite imagery. So there's a lot of different things we can do to look for sites without having to break the ground surface, because again, once we do, we're destroying our record. Invasive survey, usually in the form of shovel testing. Now, most people do 30 to 50 centimeter by 30 to 50 centimeter squares, and that's just to see to get a picture of what's below the surface without digging up large areas. Again, you can do these relatively fine-grained if you want to. You could do them every 5 meters apart. 10 meters is kind of a standard. And then again, if you're finding a unit, an excavation unit or shovel test unit with a lot of artifacts, that might be a good indication of some place that you want to expand your digging. Now, once you've decided through your survey where you want to explore in more depth, then you can start into excavation. And there are a couple different types of excavation. There's vertical and horizontal. And to know which one you want to use, you really need to have good research design. And again, this is because it's a destructive process. You want to have as much planned ahead as possible. So how much to excavate depends on the research design. So if you're looking for a settlement boundary, you might have to clear a somewhat longer space, but maybe not quite as wide. Like we were excavating for a wall, so it was a very narrow excavation. Again, if you're trying to find out what they were doing at a village, then that's a pretty big excavation. So since this is a destructive process, you want to, here we go, I don't think I put the slide in, I apologize, but since it's a destructive process, you want to keep as many documents as possible. So this is photographs, field notes, forms, lots and lots of forms. We make a lot of maps and we sketch a lot of things. We want to document the weather, and that's because if it's super, super hot, people might not be working at their best. Same as if it's super cold, then people aren't necessarily paying as much attention to what they're doing, more concerned about their own personal discomfort. So anyways, excavation. Vertical excavation we use to learn about stratigraphy, and this is generally a test of an archaeological deposit. When we were working at the Hopeton and the High Bank Earthworks in central Ohio, we did a trench to determine the building construction. What was the sequence of building for those particular earthworks. A shovel test is an example of a vertical excavation. It's just on a smaller scale than digging a trench. Horizontal excavation, which is also called area excavation, is where we expose a large area of a site. And we can do this to determine what was going on at that site or determine the site function. So, for instance, we could take a bulldozer off if we were working in central Ohio and take off the top 30 centimeters, which is the plow zone, to look for discolorations in the soil that might give us an indication of where trash pits were, or hearths, structures, and so forth. And then we could excavate a really large area to find out what really was going on at that particular site. Now, when we're collecting samples from the excavation, we want to make sure so our samples can be controlled and we get an accurate record of stratigraphy to dig straight holes and square holes and straight walls. And again, that's going to give us a controlled sample and allow us to look at their stratigraphy. So what are we sampling? We are looking for artifacts. And artifacts are any object or material that was used or manufactured by humans. Now, there are two kinds of artifacts. There are portable artifacts, which is kind of what people think about in the traditional sense, so something you could pick up and carry around. But then we also have non-portable. So these can be features, which is a generic term for something that's non-portable, so like a hearth. It could be a structure, like you see here. This is the Great Jaguar Pyramid at the site of Tikal in Guatemala. Monuments, so stela, altars. If you think about the big stone faces at Easter Island, the Moai, those would be examples of monuments also. And then earthworks, which we've been talking about both in class and you've seen some in some of the lectures. So those are examples of non-portable artifacts. We also have ecofacts, and these are archaeological finds with cultural significance but not modified by humans. So for instance, a lot of times bone is an ecofact. We can find a lot of like little amphibian bones and bird bones sometimes on sites. It's not necessarily that they're there because humans put them there. They might have just fallen into an open pit or something, but it can tell us a lot about the environment. Plant material is another one. So these things are especially useful for environmental reconstruction. Now, once an artifact is found, it's necessary to record its archaeological context, and context is simply the position of the artifact. So we're going to record its provenience. And we can do this a couple of different ways. We're going to record its provenience within an excavation unit. So where did we find it in our excavation pit? Is it in strata 1? Is it in strata 2? And so forth. Then we're going to take that whole unit and set it within the site. So are we finding that all the pits that have pottery are in one part of the site, or are they scattered all over? And this is going to help us determine site function, what were people doing and where. Then we can take that site itself and place it within a regional context. So maybe what we're finding is, like at this site, well, it's all pottery all over the place, so everybody was working on pottery. But then if we set it in a regional context, we might find out, 10 miles upriver, they were only making stone tools. Even though we might find some pieces of pottery, we don't find a lot of it. There's no indication that they were making it there, but we find what's called debitage, which is the byproducts of stone tool manufacturing. So maybe we find mounds of debitage. And then maybe at another site, we find remnants of basket weaving or something if the preservation is good. So then we can start to put together a picture of this regional thing, like where we have manufacturing centers emerging. So again, this is all starting to put things in context, and this is what we refer to as spatial context. So we need to kind of understand what's going on where.